It's important to understand how to protect an organization's data and assets because that will be part of your role as a security analyst. Fortunately, there are principles and guidelines that can be used along with NIST frameworks and the CIA triad to help security teams minimize threats and risks. In this video, we'll explore some Open Web Application Security Project, or OWASP, security principles that are useful to know as an entry level analyst. The first OWASP principle is to minimize the attack surface area. An attack surface refers to all the potential vulnerabilities that a threat actor could exploit, like attack vectors, which are pathways attackers use to penetrate security defenses. Examples of common attack vectors are phishing emails and weak passwords. To minimize the attack surface and avoid incidents from these types of vectors, security teams might disable software features, restrict who can access certain assets, or establish more complex password requirements. The principle of least privilege means making sure that users have the least amount of access required to perform their everyday tasks. The main reason for limiting access to organizational information and resources is to reduce the amount of damage a security breach could cause. For example, as an entry-level analyst, you may have access to log data, but may not have access to change user permissions. Therefore, if a threat actor compromises your credentials, they'll only be able to gain limited access to digital or physical assets, which may not be enough for them to deploy their intended attack. The next principle we'll discuss is defense in depth. Defense in depth means that an organization should have multiple security controls that address risks and threats in different ways. One example of a security control is multi-factor authentication, or MFA, which requires users to take an additional step beyond simply entering their username and password to gain access to an application. Other controls include firewalls, intrusion detection systems, and permission settings that can be used to create multiple points of defense a threat actor must get through to breach an organization. Another principle is separation of duties, which can be used to prevent individuals from carrying out fraudulent or illegal activities. This principle means that no one should be given so many privileges that they can misuse the system. For example, the person in a company who signs the paychecks shouldn't also be the person who prepares them. Only 2 more principles to go. You're doing great. Keep security simple is the next principle. As the name suggests, when implementing security controls, unnecessarily complicated solutions should be avoided because they can become unmanageable. The more complex the security controls are, the harder it is for people to work collaboratively. The last principle is to fix security issues correctly. Technology is a great tool, but can also present challenges. When a security incident occurs, security professionals are expected to identify the root cause quickly. From there, it's important to correct any identified vulnerabilities and conduct tests to ensure that repairs are successful. An example of an issue is a weak password to access an organization's Wi-Fi because it could lead to a breach. To fix this type of security issue, stricter password policies could be put in place. I know we've covered a lot, but understanding these principles increases your overall security knowledge and can help you stand out as a security professional. Now that we've covered different frameworks, controls, security principles, and compliance regulations, the question is, how do they all work together? The answer to that question is by conducting security audits. A security audit is a review of an organization's security controls, policies, and procedures against a set of expectations. There are 2 main types of security audits: external and internal. We'll focus on internal security audits because those are the types of audits that entry-level analysts might be asked to contribute to. An internal security audit is typically conducted by a team of people that might include an organization's compliance officer, security manager, and other security team members. Internal security audits are used to help improve an organization's security posture and help organizations avoid fines from governing agencies due to a lack of compliance. Internal security audits help security teams identify organizational risk, assess controls, and correct compliance issues. Now that we've discussed the purposes of internal audits, let's cover some common elements of internal audits. These include establishing the scope and goals of the audit, conducting a risk assessment of the organization's assets, completing a controls assessment, assessing compliance, and communicating results to stakeholders. In this video, we'll cover the first two elements, which are a part of the audit planning process: establishing the scope and goals, then completing a risk assessment. Scope refers to the specific criteria of an internal security audit. Scope requires organizations to identify people, assets, policies, procedures, and technologies that might impact an organization's security posture. Goals are an outline of the organization's security objectives or what they want to achieve in order to improve their security posture. Although more senior level security team members and other stakeholders usually establish the scope and goals of the audit, entry level analysts might be asked to review and understand the scope and goals in order to complete other elements of the audit. As an example, the scope of this audit involves assessing user permissions, identifying existing controls, policies, and procedures, and accounting for the technology currently in use by the organization. The goals outlined include implementing core functions of frameworks like the NIST CSF, establishing policies and procedures to ensure compliance, and strengthening system controls. The next element is conducting a risk assessment, which is focused on identifying potential threats, risks, and vulnerabilities. This helps organizations consider what security measures should be implemented and monitored to ensure the safety of assets. Similar to establishing the scope and goals, a risk assessment is oftentimes completed by managers or other stakeholders. However, you might be asked to analyze details provided in the risk assessment to consider what types of controls and compliance regulations need to be in place to help improve the organization's security posture. For example, this risk assessment highlights that there are inadequate controls, processes, and procedures in place to protect the organization's assets. Specifically, there is a lack of proper management of physical and digital assets, including employee equipment. The equipment used to store data is not properly secured, and access to private information stored in the organization's internal network likely needs more robust controls in place. Now that we've discussed the initial planning elements of an internal security audit, coming up, we'll focus on the last three elements. Previously, we discussed the initial planning elements of an internal security audit. In this video, we'll cover the final elements that an entry-level analyst might be asked to complete. As a reminder, the planning elements of internal security audits include establishing the scope and goals, then conducting a risk assessment. The remaining elements are completing a controls assessment, assessing compliance, and communicating results. Before completing these last three elements, you'll need to review the scope and goals as well as the risk assessment and ask yourself some questions. For example, what is the audit meant to achieve? Which assets are most at risk? Are current controls sufficient to protect those assets? If not, what controls and compliance regulations need to be implemented? Considering questions like these can support your ability to complete the next element, A controls assessment. A controls assessment involves closely reviewing an organization's existing assets, then evaluating potential risks to those assets to ensure internal controls and processes are effective. To do this, entry-level analysts might be tasked with classifying controls into the following categories: administrative controls, technical controls, and physical controls. Administrative controls are related to the human component of cybersecurity. They include policies and procedures that define how an organization manages data, such as the implementation of password policies. Technical controls are hardware and software solutions used to protect assets, such as the use of intrusion detection systems, or IDSs, and encryption. Physical controls refer to measures put in place to prevent physical access to protected assets, such as surveillance cameras and locks. The next element is determining whether or not the organization is adhering to necessary compliance regulations. As a reminder, compliance regulations are laws that organizations must follow to ensure private data remains secure. In this example, the organization conducts business in the European Union and accepts credit card payments. So they need to adhere to the GDPR and Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, or PCI DSS. The final common element of an internal security audit is communication. Once the internal security audit is complete, results and recommendations need to be communicated to stakeholders. In general, this type of communication summarizes the scope and goals of the audit. Then, it lists existing risks and notes how quickly those risks need to be addressed. Additionally, it identifies compliance regulations the organization needs to adhere to and provides recommendations for improving the organization's security posture. Internal audits are a great way to identify gaps within an organization. When I worked at a previous company, my team and I conducted an internal password audit and found that many of the passwords were weak. Once we identified this issue, the compliance team took the lead and began enforcing stricter password policies. Audits are an opportunity to determine what security measures an organization has in place and what areas need to be improved to achieve the organization's desired security posture.